DeShield Green and Mike Silver for all of their work in putting together this meeting, sending out our agendas, assembling the packets, and keeping us rolling towards our goals. Also would like to recognize that Judge Andrew Heath is here present with us, the Director of AOC. Thank you, and appreciate your helping us move this forward. Thank you. Sir. After 8 months, I think we have gotten our arms around the individual components of the task before us. Remote proceedings are continuing throughout the state, and we have begun the process of putting together the components that will be necessary for a unified system. In software terms, we're working on building version 1.0. Even as we build this first version, we will identify things that can be done better. I hope that we can avoid the temptation of making the perfect the enemy of the good as we go forward. We have made good progress since our April meeting, but I expect the pace will pick up in the next few months as we assemble the component parts that we've been working on. Before we get into our progress in the road ahead, first I would like for us to consider approving the minutes for our April 1st, 2022 meeting. Ms. Green forwarded them to you. We've had one update. Our court reporter member, Ms. Kimmel McDermott, proposed an additional paragraph concerning captioning for hearing impaired that has now been provided to all of our members. If you all would please take a moment to review the minutes if you've not had an opportunity to do so.
They're not in your packet. They were emailed to you previously.
All right, thank you. Let me ask you, do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
No motion.
In a second?
Second.
All right, all in favor? Aye. All right, thank you very much. The minutes have been approved. Everyone should have a copy of our agenda, and Ms. Green, if you could please display that on the screen. Thank you. It's included on the screen above you. We're going to have a technology update from Mr. Anthony Whitmore and the folks from Proceedings. Matt Osborne and Troy Page will lead us in a discussion regarding the legal issues of a defendant waiving his or her personal appearance. And finally, we will have updates for our 4 subcommittees. And before we begin to address the items on the agenda, I would like to give you all an overview of the challenges that we've identified, summarize the progress that we've made, and also mention some of the challenges that we've yet to find solutions for. So on the screen, you will see a chart that I've used to help me visualize the project. And forgive me if it is overly simple, but it's how I've come to best understand our work. In the first column, I've identified the institutions and subcommittees, the prisons, jails, detention centers, and crime lab that are the fundamental units that we are working with. In the next 5 columns, we've identified the major problems that we're attempting to solve. The 5 columns are lanes as I think of them are first software. So the first major issue that we're going to have to resolve to address remote proceedings is the software needed to conduct the video conferences. Fortunately, we have a solution for each of our 4 components, the prisons, jails, detention centers, and crime lab. We're going to use WebEx as the basis for doing this. Put that first so we have a quick, easy win. The next issue that we have to address is equipment. What hardware do we need to conduct these hearings? So I've broken that down in both the courtroom as well as the institution that will be, in a sense, sending the video to us. In the courtroom, we have found a solution, and the Crave system or some similar solution that allows everyone to see and hear the proceedings that are going on and do so in a way that is dependable and less taxing on those that are participating. If remote hearings will simply be too hard if we do it with 3 computers sitting in the courtroom, a computer on the judge's bench, a computer at the defense table, and a computer at the prosecutor's table. That is quite challenging for folks that have tried to conduct hearings in that way. It'll be difficult, frankly, to get buy-in if there's that much friction in doing these hearings. And Crave offers a solution for that, and Anthony Whitmore is going to update us on the progress of installation in the Crave system. We also have to have the hardware in prisons, jails, detention centers, and the crime lab for communicating with the courts. I understand at this point, if we look at prisons, that each prison has at least 1 station at this point. And I believe Jody Harrison can talk to us a little bit more about that when we have a review of the prison subcommittee. In our jails, Ferris County, we have the pilot. We have what we have called 2 jail courtrooms that are set up. The equipment necessary is really pretty simple. A laptop will do it. We use a laptop and a larger screen that is connected to and a remote camera. I think the expense for setting one of those up for us was about $600. Each detention center now has a Cisco WebEx product that they have used to conduct remote hearings. I don't know that they have more than one. Some facilities may have more than one, but each facility has at least one. And the crime lab does not fit neatly into this schedule, but of course they also need equipment to communicate with the courts and a simple laptop, and each analyst has a laptop that he or she can use to do that. Beginning this process out, we have limited space and limited technology in our jails and prisons. Hopefully, if we prove that this can be successful, down the road, this will be built out, and laptops and tablets could take the place of vans in some instances. Our next challenge is scheduling. So getting everyone at the right place at the right time. For prisons, Mr. John Woodlock, who is with us here, has set up a protocol to use for our pilot with Piedmont Correctional. It involves sending emails to a person with certain information and the use of the prison's video meeting management application that they have developed. We have worked again drafting what we're calling a virtual writ to make it clear that this is going to be a remote proceeding instead of the need to send someone. For our jails, AOC is working with Presidio to develop an application that will automate much of the scheduling. Mr. Whitmore and folks from Presidio will discuss that with us shortly. It's hoped, or at least I hope, that we can develop a single app somewhere down the line to assist in scheduling all of these matters, but that's not going to be version.
Sorry.
No problem. This that is not going to be version 1.0. I understand that the court counselors are largely carrying the burden of scheduling juvenile matters. And if we could back up to that chart, I think that would help me. And Billy Laster and Eric Zogary will update us on this. And finally, the DAs, ADAs, and the folks at the crime lab already have a system for scheduling analysts testifying in person, and they're using the same system to schedule trials with lab analysts. So we already know how to get everybody in the right place at the right time in the ordinary process in district court trials, simply adding the lab analyst, and they're using the procedures that they did previously. So the next column of challenges is communication, private communication between lawyers and inmates. And Murray Corrections has piloted a plan for this. I understand that Piedmont Correction will be next. And Ms. Harrison can also update us about that project. And our pilot in Cabarrus will soon have the video option for lawyers to use from their offices. So the Murray pilot is audio only. Cabarrus is in the process of contracting with NCIC to provide a video option for that. Detention centers and juvenile matters, I understand, are dealing with that on a case-by-case basis. And finally, again, with the crime lab, it's not exactly the same problem, but lawyers need to communicate with lab analysts before hearings so that they have an opportunity to go through the report with them, which they normally do when the lab analyst arrives. And there's been a system set up, so we've had 4 trials in Cabarrus so far, and lawyers can call the analyst ahead of time. So we have a solution for that somewhat different communication challenge. And I would say in talking through the communication issue with folks from our local jails, Piedmont Correctional and others, we've identified another concern, and that is the potential misuse of confidential information. That apparatus that's going to allow folks to communicate in private. You know, typically when an inmate communicates with someone other than their lawyer, there is telephone calls are monitored, mail can be monitored. This would give an avenue, intentionally or unintentionally, and hopefully folks would not do this intentionally, where it could be used to communicate with other people. And so we are going to need to work to make sure that does not occur, and that lawyers should understand that, but work with the education piece to make sure folks don't understand that, do understand that cannot happen. And I've contacted the state bar, and we're going to have a group of folks that will work together. Hopefully we can have an opinion by the bar regarding the use of this type of communication. And then the final column is documents. How do we exchange documents? And we have, at this point, conceived of using it in 3 primary ways. The advisement of counsel, accepting guilty pleas, and issues concerning replacement of counsel, those sorts of things. So in the initial challenge for advisements, defendants have to sign waivers if they waive the right to court-appointed counsel. They have to fill out affidavits if they're seeking court-appointed counsel. Those documents need to be at the court at the time of the hearing so the judge can review those and that they can be certified by the clerk. Same thing with plea transcripts. I understand that's being handled in an ad hoc way as well through faxes and emails. I've talked with some lawyers in our district, and one common way that it's done is when the lawyer's going through a plea transcript with his or her client. When it's finished, the person that's keeping that individual in custody, maybe right outside the door, the person steps in, and the lawyer says, I finished the transcript, I'd like to email it to you or fax it to you. Can you ask the defendant to sign it and get it back to us? Again, it's a case-by-case way of doing that. We need to have a way that the clerks, if somebody's signing a waiver, that we get that information to the facilities prior to the hearing. Somewhere down the road, it'd be great if we could have an e-signature, the way that we do for DocuSign for buying a house or somewhere along those lines. I've had beginning discussions with Brad Fowler about the possibility of that. We're not there yet. Hopefully that'll be an ultimate solution that we can get to. But for now, we're going to need to find a way to transfer these documents back and forth. Crime Lab's a little different. The documents that need to be forwarded is the report of the analyst to the defense attorney. And the process for that is that the DA must give notice of the hearing, and at that time, the report is sent over to the DA, or rather to the defense attorney. So we have something in process for that. We are working on solutions for these, but these were things that are going to be developed through the work in our subcommittees and also through practice. There are numerous other details that we're going to have to work through in our pilots and subcommittees, and I just want to mention a couple of those that we've identified. Who records these meetings? Who sends out the invitations? Is a fee affidavit necessary for an incarcerated person? If you're going to appoint counsel, do we need a special writ? Do we need a special subpoena or cover sheet to subpoena the lab analyst? Can we use shared emails instead of being dependent on an email going to a single individual to provide notice or transfer documents? Should in-person remote hearings how should they be organized and run in the courtroom? When are waivers needed? Which cases have priority? And there are other issues that obviously we're going to identify, but those are some that we have thus far identified and are beginning to work on. For what it's worth, just seeing this chart helps me organize things. And I would encourage folks, if you all see additional problems we need to work on, if we can identify them as we go, that would be of great help. At this point, I would like to introduce Mr. Anthony Whitmore, who's going to give us an update on the technology challenges that we face and some of the solutions that have been found.
All right, thank you, sir. I would start by saying I commend you on that matrix. For those of us in the technology field, that's what we call a business analysis requirements matrix. If you need a part-time job, TSP has an opening for somebody. Do that level of detail. No, seriously, that's a great document, and it's really something that we need to work from, so commend you with that. CRAVE, so that folks, a little bit of history here. CRAVE stands for Courtroom Audio Visual Experience. So this is a technology initiative where, I've talked about it before, I think, where all 100 counties are destined to receive courtroom video conferencing technology where it would consist of high definition monitors like we have in the room here, robotic cameras that would track sound along with speakers and microphones and so forth. And we consider that to be the foundational needs for what it's going to take within the courtroom to be able to talk to the remotians, jails, prisons, and other facilities across the state. Where we are right now is we have 7 counties. You can see the 7 counties there on the screen where we have actually deployed technology I just mentioned in these courtrooms, in these counties, in these courtrooms. Some of these counties may have 2 courtrooms or 1 courtroom that are ready to go. I know several counties, Judge McGee is using, definitely Judge Corpening down in New Hanover has been using this technology quite a while. You can see as well, we have another county that is next week, I believe it is, Polk County, that we're destined to install this technology in. Little regrettable that we are not further along. One of the things that we have found is that there's a little bit of a struggle with getting the cabling, getting these high definition monitor electrical cable installed within the courtroom, getting the video feed cable installed in the courtroom and the cameras and so forth has been a bit of a challenge for the counties. There are 50 counties today who have the schematics, the site survey schematics of what is needed for their courtrooms in regards to this cabling. Judge Heath has taken it upon himself to, as a means to maybe helping out the counties, sending notifications to county managers, CCing the elected sheriff on the advantages, efficiencies with this courtroom technology. I think most of those letters have gone out by now, encouraging folks to engage with their AOC counterparts, clerk, judges, and so forth to try to get the cabling that I talked about installed, because that's going to be the next step. You can see where we've completed the site surveys in almost 100% of the destined courtrooms. 207 courtrooms are destined to receive this infrastructure. 199 surveys have been completed. we're looking to get the 50 county, actually, I think the numbers are 40-some counties that don't have the results of the site surveys by the end of next month, I believe it is, Jerry. So all 100 counties should have site surveys of the cabling needs for each of these 207 courtrooms in hand so that they can start determining what their budgetary requirements are, who's actually going to pull the cable, and so forth. So that's really the next step to get this video conferencing infrastructure in the remaining counties. I don't know, Judge Heath, is there anything to add? I know, Judge McGee, did you want folks to take a look at the video? I know in addition to Judge Heath's letter, there was an accompanied video where Judge McGee and myself talked about the advantages of Crave, as well as I believe the Cabarrus County Sheriff talked about. I don't know if everybody's had a chance to take a look at that video. I've heard some feedback, but
And Todd Shanley was also a part of that. At our conference, I told folks about Crave and encouraged them to contact AFC if they were interested in working, or ready to work with them to have it installed. And I just asked, if you have used this system, please raise your hand. And I think 3 or 4 judges had raised their hand, and those were all folks that had been in Cabarrus and had rotated through. So I think, I talked about earlier with folks the challenge of having multiple computers in the courtroom and how taxing that is, and trying to make sure the technology is working, and it's just a drain to make sure that all that's going on. And when we use the Crave system, you walk in and it just works. It's just a different experience, and so trying to convey that to folks I think is important. And so if you haven't watched it, or if we can play it, I think that might be helpful folks understand.
sure.
Yes.
Your Honor, before we start, I have a quick question for you. So when you do these site surveys and you talk to people, are they telling you they want it in Superior Court and that's where you guys are putting most of it? Or are they saying, hey, let's do one in one court, one in the other court? Or are we kind of forgetting District Court? And because again, for the crime lab kind of thing, is like we're in District Court, and if you're putting them all in Superior Court, then we have problems because it's not really serving us.
Yes, sir.
Or serving anyone in that situation.
So we meet with judges, clerks of court, and district attorneys, I believe, as well, may be a part of it. And it's up to the discretion of those folk where they're going to get the most value. It's not really an AOC decision. It's a little bit more of a AOC leadership in that county or that district's discretion as to what courtrooms they're going to get the most advantage from.
Do you know, I know this is putting you on a spot, do you know how many of the counties have said, yeah, we'd like it in this court as opposed to that court? I assume they're only getting one grave unit, right? They're not getting one for each courtroom that they have open.
So
Well, here, I can jump in, that's fine. So each county will get two
Okay.
at least, and we have deferred to the local courthouse leadership team as to which courtrooms they want to install their units. This is good feedback, and I think one of the benefits of having a group like this together is that it solidifies that the crime lab is on board for actually utilizing this ability under the statute to do virtual testimony.
Yes.
And so we can start, as we communicate with the county leadership, emphasizing that it would be nice to have at least one in district court to accommodate that.
Yes, because we did a test with New Hanover County and Judge Corpening with it, and it was amazing. It was exactly what we were looking for, and their response was, well, we have it in this, and it's sometimes hard to get that courtroom because we share it with Superior Court, and so it became a scheduling issue more than anything in regards to you had it, but you couldn't get to it because they were running different schedules and things like that.
My suspicion is that as counties get their units, they will see the benefit, and then we can expand this program. That's my hope. I mean, I don't know what how your district court feels about it, but.
We're transitioning to a new courthouse, so we only have one installed, and it's in Superior Court. But Todd Shanley and the IT folks at Cabarrus have been very helpful in having a similar solution for us. So the one that we have in District Court is what our county put together. Moving into our new facility, they're gonna be equally divided between district and Superior Court. That's what made the most sense to us. And I don't know the exact number, but our county is working by additional units so that we will not just have the ones that AOC gives us, but we'll have the ones that the county will have, and then AOC is gonna help support that. So, my sense is that a good many of these have been put in district courts, the ones that have been installed, but Anthony may know better than me.
Do we know which counties have done district by any chance?
It was not something we were tracking, but I can pull it up for it.
Okay.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll emphasize that.
Just to note, I know we're talking about district court, superior court. I'm a small county, I only have 2 courtrooms, and we have one already done, and looking forward to the second one done. But we have found it very useful in clerk hearings as well. I've had remote testimony from, just last week, I had an incompetency proceeding where I had a doctor in Durham and a doctor in Greenville. Neither one wanted to travel 3 or 4 hours to Perquimans County, but we're happy to remote it in, and everybody consented to it, and we use that as well for our clerk hearings, not just district and superior courts, but those things for us out in the far reaches it's valuable in that aspect as well.
Thank you.
So are you having to go into I guess you have to go into the courtroom, are you seeking an additional unit for?
Well, I only have 2 courtrooms, so, I mean, that's gonna work out perfect for me, and we do our, when we have to do the Craig hearing, of course, we're gonna courtroom to do it.
A smaller unit would probably make sense for that hearing that he was describing, though, that desktop version that we're using in the jail side.
Yes, Mr. Clerk, I don't know if you have a separate hearing room for clerk's proceedings or just your office, or if you go in the courtroom, but we can get you set up.
But, I mean, it's a valuable tool on that level as well. I just want to know that.
Judge McGee, I just want to comment on your comment about the conference. So you sent me a couple of names, so I did reach out to my counterparts in those counties that, have kind of reached out. So I'm trying to be the Crave ambassador for this side of the house. I can tell you, as much as that letter to the county managers might be a good idea from a management side, I don't think it's gonna be as well received as you guys might hope. I would say that we have a very good IT environment at the county level, and that we should be utilizing the IT directors more. So I'd like to work with you on that to figure out how we get that communication, because I'm getting a lot of feedback from folks seeing this as a unfunded mandate from Raleigh. So it's not being well received in the counties, let's just say that.
Okay, well, that's good feedback.
Sorry. I mean, I hate to be the bearer of the bad news, and it's been, Crave is very positive and we like it, but I can tell you that I have a lot of colleagues and friends that are not pleased between this and the wireless project, getting those, because they're just hitting off budget, is what it is. It's not that they don't want to participate, it's just the timing of it. We just entered our new fiscal years. Now they're getting these letters saying, hey, we need an extra couple $1,000s to start these projects, and it's bad timing.
Gotcha. I'll get with you offline. So I just got it up. We've sent 31 of those letters out. So there's still time to readjust, both on the suggesting district court side and who we're actually reaching out to. So.
And like I said, in some counties it's probably fine, but in the larger ones that are, my capacity, I get something from my boss says, hey, go do this. It's kind of, you end up with a chip on your shoulder to begin with. So I think if we come at it from a cohort angle, we might be a little more successful.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Your Honor, Clerk Ball from Johnston County is on the call, and she has sent in the chat that she is a clerk that has a separate hearing room. Her county has installed a big screen TV to use, but a small McCrave system would be very helpful.
Okay, Clerk Ball. All right. Thank you.
I'm Marty McGee. I'm the senior resident Superior Court judge in Cabarrus County, Judicial District 19A. At the beginning of the pandemic, we had to try to figure out how to keep the court going, and so we reached out to our county IT folks, and through trial and error, we eventually found a system that we could use where we could see and hear everyone and continue to conduct business. And we got to the point where I thought it worked pretty well. But the Crave system, when it was installed, was certainly a step up from where we were. Under the old system, I had to plug in my laptop, and I was constantly worried about the technology. Is it working? And with the Crave system, it does away with that. When you walk in the courtroom, it's on, it just works. And so I'm much less concerned about the technology, and I can just do the work that I'm there to take care of.
Anthony Whitmore, Chief Technology Officer with the Judicial Branch. In layman's terms, it's a video system for courtrooms in the North Carolina court system. It is the courtroom audio video experience system, acronym is CRAVE. Typical courtroom is going to include at least 2 high-definition monitors that's placed somewhere within the courtroom. Depending upon the physical layout of the courtroom. There is also going to be microphones and speakers throughout the courtroom, prosecution, defense tables, as well as the judge's bench. There's also going to be cameras placed depending upon the layout of the courtroom, typically two robotic type cameras that allow for tracking of whatever sound is going on in the courtroom. There is also going to be a touchpad type device that would allow the judge to be able to control both the WebEx session. We use WebEx as our video conferencing infrastructure, and that also allows the judge to stop any video or any audio that needs to occur.
My name is Van Shaw, and I'm the sheriff of Cabarrus County. The CRAVE program is an audio-visual program where we are able to utilize audio-visual to have inmates be able to have hearings here locally in the jail and remotely at other correctional facilities in relation to the court. So it helps us in being able to not have to transfer inmates in and out of the courtroom, as well as having to travel across the state and bring inmates back for what may be a very brief hearing. The largest advantage that we've seen has been the significant decrease in the amount of transports that we've had to conduct over the past several months. It keeps us from having to make long trips to bring an inmate back for a very short court hearing. It keeps us from having to transfer inmates from the detention facility into the courtroom. So we keep them in a safe environment. We have less worries about escapes, confrontations, those types of things. So it really is a much more efficient utilization of resources. And in times when all sheriff's offices across the state are struggling with manpower levels within our detention facility, this is just an extremely good way to best utilize those manpower resources.
I'm Todd Shanley. I'm the CIO of Cabarrus County. So during the pandemic, Cabarrus County supported the court system with video solutions to be able to make courts run. I think the long-term goal of this is to be able to do that across multiple jails, not just shortening that distance from across the street, but shortening that distance from across the state so that inmates don't have to be transported from Raleigh, from the coast, from the mountains, to be able to have a very short court appearance and be able to do that in a very quick process. So that is our goal from a technology standpoint, is to be able to support that and help that implementation go forward.
I think the initial big gains are going to be from the sheriff's department. They're not going to have to transport folks from their jails to the courtrooms, and that's particularly helpful to places that their jails are not connected to the courthouse. So there's not only the savings of the expense saving, but it's certainly safer. So I think it's a great opportunity. It is a great system that allows you to do your work without focusing on the technology.
Ask a follow-up question. The smaller CRAVE units, I think they're called the WebEx Pros, those are part of what is being rolled out as well, as I understand it. And I'm not certain if we had talked about possibly installing one in our jail to assist with that. I guess the clerk's office would be another possible option for that.
Yes, sir. So with 2 CRAVE courtroom implementations, that would come with two WebEx Desk Pros, and those are the 4x4 type platform size devices. We have typically found in court, particularly in New Hanover County Juvenile Court, that has been a great device to sit outside the courtroom for juvenile or even for victims who didn't want to participate in the courtroom to be able to see the WebEx session. So it's a small WebEx type device that WebEx session comes on, that device comes on, it can be voice activated as well. So yes, sir. Short answer is one per Crave courtroom configuration. But we have also been able to partner with some folks, like I think we have one in your jail, I believe it is.
Yes.
It's a little more expensive solution with some of the other things, but as we just talked to Mr. Caldwell a while ago, you can do it on one of these. You can do it on one of these from the jail if you have a camera and microphone and speakers. It just depends on what the budget is.
So for those of us that are here or listening to the meeting, if you don't have a Crave unit in your county, what would be the next step for them to contact you? Or who should they contact to make that step?
I would suggest calling our help desk. By doing that, that creates a ticket, and we can track tickets all across the state, all 100 counties. Mr. Hutchinson's team would be able to get those out. We have the inventory in the warehouse, so I think that's something that we could do.
It's local leadership talking with their counties, making sure that they're on board, ready to go, and then contacting the help desk.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Now, make sure I'm clear on the ask. We're talking within the courthouse.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I just think this is a central building block to making this work for folks to realize that you don't have to struggle with technology the way we did early on in the process. This just works for folks. I think it's key to making this a success.
Yes, sir.
Judge, I'll tell you, I went and met with my sheriff and my county manager, and like I said, I'm a small county, and we share a jail with two other counties, and my jail's 21 miles away from my courthouse. To go pick up a prisoner, bring him back for a 10-minute hearing, carry him back to the jail, come back to the courthouse, that's an 84-mile trip. My sheriff could not wait to get it installed in our county, and when my county manager realized the cost savings in fuel and time, they both jumped on board really quick. But it was after I went and sat down with them and talked to them about it. So, getting local leaders involved to talk with your county people is probably beneficial.
That's a great point, Judge McGee. Honestly, we haven't thought about if a county is struggling with an immersive Crave system in the courtroom, they simply want to move forward with one of these WebEx Desk Pro devices, that's a much quicker install and get it up and operational. So before I turn it over to Presidio, and we do have Presidio's executive leadership here, just sort of to remind folks the scope of the WebEx scheduling app. The scope is simply what we heard, business requirements is we wanted to get an application that would allow for simple drop-down type menu where the clerk could send a jail facility a schedule. Monday, court is going to be held 9 to 4, and that would allow the jail facility to determine, yes, that inmate is actually in my facility, and secondarily, that inmate can be available at 10 a.m. So that's really at a very high level what this first phase of the application is designed to do. Send an email basically to the jail. The jailer fills out the information, and everyone is knowing and understanding that on X day, X inmate will be available at X time. So I'm gonna turn it over to the Presidio folks. I'm not sure if Jeff is going to present, or Brian, are you going to present?
Yeah.
Okay. Feel free to come up to the table. Please do fill in the gap for anything I just left out.
No, he covered it pretty well, I think. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. I appreciate you guys giving us a little bit of time to give you an update of where we are with the project. I know that we're hoping that we could potentially get a demo. We don't have all the functionality built behind the scenes, so but I will give you an update of where we're at and where we will be, hopefully by the time we have the next task force meeting. So we actually started this project off in June and have been working with various team members across AOC and the task force, including Judge McGee, Anthony Whitmore, and several other team members. We started the project development off immediately in June, worked through a lot of the design activities. We've completed the discovery activities in July, worked through, and we'll actually show you what we've actually built. So I've got screenshots of all the user experience. So basically the screens, the web experience you'll have. And the work the team is doing this month is going to be completing the development work and doing all the integrations with the required services and doing the testing. We'll finish up that testing in September, and that's when the platform will actually be released for use across the court system. I stepped through, these are just various screens of the actual application. So when you come into the platform itself, you'll always be logging into the system and using the experience and connecting with WebEx. When you log in, you also have the ability to, of course, log out. You have a portion of your user experience of who you are, so you always see that connection back to the services. Now the clerks go in to actually set up the hearing itself. They'll have this screen that gives them the access to both join a hearing over on the left-hand side, and down the rest of the screen is basically they will fill out the fields, basically fill out the form required to give the information on what courtroom, the event, who the offender is, and all the participants. And once we complete all that required information, then we'll also have the details on adding any optional services that were described as part of our requirements, including interpreters, and getting the availability dates, since we do want to use the Crave systems as well. When they send out once they submit that and submit the actual request, that'll send a confirmation out. This kind of gives a view of what the confirmation will look like as we send out to all the assigned parties for the actual schedule. In addition, you will also have a docket of upcoming hearings. So this is each of the hearings that have been scheduled, and unfortunately, and Jeff can confirm this, I believe this will be done based on the court and the clerk, so that you only see the ones that are actually impacting you, not necessarily seeing every single one that's scheduled in the system.
Yeah, it's contextual to who is logged in. So this would be a courtroom that's logged in. So you get docket view for your courtroom. If a jailer logs in, they would get hearings that are assigned to them. So it's contextual.
Thanks, Jeff, for confirming. I thought we had that set up. You also have the ability to go in and get further details within the record. This will include the ability to actually join a session or join the actual hearing, or exit out of it if you needed to. As part of the system, we've also we're building in the ability to have a past hearings docket. This will help the clerk and judge and everyone will see what has occurred and be able to track and see what those results and the activities are. with some additional supporting, deeper information available as part of that. And so the next steps we've got, we do have to plan out and identify the pilot sites for testing out the scheduling platform. Gather some of that feedback and the usage activities so that we can maximize adoption across the court systems. And this is a little bit of the art of the possible. Looking forward to those future releases once we get this first version out around document management, supporting the courtroom streaming, real-time WebEx interpretation and transcriptions, and be able to store that information in the system, as well as continue to improve the availability and scheduling. So this just kind of gives you a chance to see everything. We'll share this PowerPoint to Shield so she can get it out to everyone as well.
I think it might be helpful to go back a couple slides
Sure.
to go to the joint the docket and just kind of the simplicity of starting hearing by clicking the join button.
Yeah, absolutely. So as part of the docket, we've included the join button feature. So this will give you the chance you just go into the system and select it, almost like as if you join a meeting within Outlook, connected to WebEx meetings via Outlook. So this gives the same type of user experience for you.
Hi, this is Lori. I have a question about the accessibility of this. Will there be a way for the facility, like people in the facility, to make sure that the board is aware if there are accessibility needs for the individuals to participate, for example, if they're deaf, or if they need some other type of accommodation?
Yeah, so I'll answer that one. So the services, it's kind of, it's an optional field. So part of the planning, we had some identified, such as interpretation services. If the user requires other services, those can be added in that drop down right there for any kind of further accessibility needs that offender or otherwise party would need access to.
Thanks, Jeff. Is that a fillable field, or will those need to be built in to indicate that there's a disability access concern or a foreign language, like in the specific language? Because there's also going to be some lag time between making those arrangements, and that's really important that the coordinators of those services get looped in as well.
Yeah, so we actually had an entire meeting about this. There's a interpretation services form that you guys fill out now to request interpretation services. We are going to hook into that. So when you request an interpreter to ask you the language, it kind of mimics that form, but without having to go to that form and go to two different places. So hope that answers your question.
There's actually another form. There's a separate form for disability access concerns. So it may be necessary to also loop into that to coordinate with those as well. Otherwise, you won't catch the people who need sign language access or any other type of access on a spoken foreign language form.
Perfect. Yeah, it's very, I imagine it's very similar to the interpretation form. And that's something we have the details on how to hook into. So we're going to be using those existing tools that you have on your side for this app. And it's really, we're just trying to make this the least amount of steps, the most efficient as possible. So if those forms that you already have, we're just going to be reusing those without having to actually go to the form filled out. You kind of use this as a front end for that form.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll take your feedback to.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, we'll take your feedback so we can verify that we've actually set that up.
Accessibility was a big topic of the last hearing, task force hearing. And WebEx has really done a lot in the last quarter with their accessibility features. So more to come on that, but we're really excited about what's to come with that as far as live interpretation and translation between different languages.
Great, thank you. Our disability access form is currently being updated. We'll actually have sign language interpreters, like videos of it in our form as well. I'm also wanted to just repeat the suggestion that having someone with disabilities test the actual product will help us make sure that it's accessible before it rolls out, and not have to do any repairs on the back end, which would probably be more difficult.
Absolutely. For the pilot, we want to cover every use case, and we really want the pilot to be users that are not afraid to speak their mind and give us feedback. So this is an iterative process. This is, as Judge McGee said, this is version 1.0, but we built it out to be extensible for those different use cases.
Thank you.
So could you tell me what will trigger court actors to stand up a hearing on the system?
So the scheduler view, somebody actually goes in and schedules the hearing. So in front of them, they would have the details to schedule number of hearings at one time. Probably they're not going in one at a time. So they can go in the scheduler view and, just schedule 1, 2, 3, 4 dozens at a time. And that'll alleviate a lot of their back and forth emails between different parties. That's kind of the goal, right? To make it easier to schedule between a number of different parties. So they would have to manually schedule like they are now. It's just an interface that allows people to bring these parties together easier than email, with all the context of who's logged in, what kind of case it is, the case number, what participants are involved, etc.
So I just wonder if, let's say, a defendant appears before a magistrate, is detained, and is awaiting time on a district court calendar for assignment of counsel. Can that be automatically flagged somehow in the system to alert somebody to set up a virtual hearing, so that from the get-go, we're going to do it virtually rather than the default staying where the inmate is physically transferred? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and right now, this system is set up to interact with the kind of the current process. So where the clerk of the courts is actually scheduling the actual hearings themselves. They're doing those manual tasks. The goal of this is to give just one place to be able to work with it. I don't know if we had a detailed conversation about the entire process of starting off from where you're actually talking through. And I don't think we've actually talked through that entire workflow to see if we would want to extend this. But again, the system is designed to be extensible, so that we could start off with this portion, make it a little bit, make that part of the workflow a little bit easier, and then we can look for other points of entry to extend and enhance it.
I don't know enough about that part of the process, what actually happens to get the inmate,
Ted right there can tell you. I was gonna say, or the clerk here, he can tell you. I was like looking at me, I was like, I'm gonna defer to Ted.
And I just think generally we should have the mindset that we want to eventually make it the default that we're using this technology rather than driving people back and forth right off the bat.
Judge, again, being a small county, I don't have a judge in my county every day. I may go a week and not have a judge but one day. Monday morning, I'll tell you, my criminal clerk's gonna come in, the magistrate's gonna turn their work in, they're gonna go through, they're gonna see who's in jail, they're gonna see who needs to have a first appearance hearing within the 72 hours, and they're gonna set it up for either me to do if there's not gonna be a judge available, or for the judge to do, if we got, and go ahead and say everything. That's the first thing they do on Monday morning, to see who has to have those hearings.
So they just kind of do it.
It's part of the process. It's the Monday morning checklist.
from.
it's checked every day at Cabarrus once the magistrate turns it in, and then it goes to the clerk, and then they set it up at that point when it needs to be done. But if somebody, I think I replied to this email here with this right here, that if somebody comes into Cabarrus with Chatham County charges, they're not getting it done in 72 hours. I'll put it to you right now, it's not, and that's what stinks. So if it can be flagged off the bat to do this, that's great, because if not, the clerk will then mail it to Chatham County, then by the time they get a writ issued, you're looking at 7 or 8 days. All right, so, I mean, that's just where we are right now. To simplify up front, kind of like what you're saying, whether we can do what Quemmons is doing, I didn't bring this up, Judge, but whether we can do it at our place or just, that's just what we gotta figure out. We don't know how to do that.
And I think automating it, once we build the capacity, would be a wonderful thing. I think building up the capacity to do it. And we talked about this issue, if somebody's from another county in our jail, as I understand it, perhaps the best view right now, as I understand it, is it needs to be done in that county, which makes that very difficult. But once we have this established, then if there's someone in our county from Quemmons and there needs to be a hearing, then there'll be a way that we could alert them and they can do that remotely, assuming that legally that means they're in the county if they're virtually on the screen in Quemmons. So I think there's a lot of legal issues that are still open, but that certainly would get it done quicker in that county with a local judicial official making that call.
If I could piggyback on that, Your Honor, as a prosecutor in court, we're doing the calendar call, the person doesn't answer up, somebody jumps onto CJ Leeds, finds out, oh, they're in Cabarrus County in custody. That's the first time we're learning of it. So there does need to be discussion about how to be proactive in figuring out who needs hearings in other locations and things like that. Because that's going to be the biggest positive for this from the prosecution standpoint is the out-of-county hearings.
And you know, part of our process is if we have a defendant arrested and incarcerated from another county, we scan the paperwork in and mail it to that county, email it to that county when they're going through the morning paperwork. We notify the clerk's office in that county that, you know, your defendant is here in our jail and was arrested. We mail the original paperwork, but we also scan and email it immediately when we get it.
I was wondering, is juvenile being part of the scheduling app that you're working on? Is there any discussions about that?
Not right now. It kind of goes back to the scope of this effort. We're targeting 2 counties for the pilot. This is for the pilot, 2 counties and 3 jails. 3 jails, I believe it is. And it's totally based off of feedback that we're getting from Judge McGee and Judge Bedore right now. Yes, there's scalability, just like we just talked about scalability in building the app out for the 72-hour hearings and so forth. But
Well, we would love it because I have the Quemmons problem every day. Every kid in our facility is more than 24 miles away. I'm driving hundreds of miles a day to get kids to court, and so this would be huge to help with scheduling. We
yes, sir.
definitely need it.
Yes, sir. So, and again, right now, we're just looking at the jails. Then we want to do, I think what we heard, the most immediate need from the task force chief, jails, then scale out to potentially DP, DAC facilities, potentially SBI, labs, juvenile facilities, and so forth.
My vote would be move juvenile up, because don't they have to have hearings every 7 days if they're in custody?
Every 10 days, yeah.
10 days, there you go. So I would say that they should go closer to the top of the list just from my non-lawyer side of the house.
Thank you.
And by default, just clarify, yeah, I live with one and she complains about that kind of stuff. Yes, right. I live with a lawyer, not a juvenile in custody, but a lawyer that says that, yeah, that's where she would have liked to have started. If she had employed me to do this, the juveniles was where we should have started, because because she runs juvenile court in our county.
But there is a much greater equipment hurdle with that, because these juveniles are in how many different facilities all around the state?
Yeah, we have an operating virtual court in every detention center right now, and it's all based off of the Cisco system. So it's completely compatible with the Crave system. The problem that we have is that a lot of the courtrooms are not set up yet, and so in each different courtroom, because we're set up to do Cisco, some counties are still not there yet, and so we're still having to drop one of our court counselor laptops on the desk for the judge to make it happen. And so it's really getting this Crave system out to all the court districts across the state that would make a big difference. And so when you're talking about district court, that's huge. I mean, we need this in district courtrooms to make it work for juvenile.
I have a question, and I apologize. This is my first time at one of these meetings in person. The scheduling app is just a side communication path, right? There's no bilateral, unilateral communication with any of the other court systems like ICMS or e-warrants?
No, sir.
Okay. So this is just
That's not to say there's not scalability and flexibility.
I'm not asking for the moon of the first. I just wanted to make sure. So this is just a simplified way to communicate setting up these hearings that are being scheduled manually by the clerks?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. But again, there's an eye towards
yeah.
CMS, e-warrants, but that's another API, that's another integration.
Oh, I get it. That's the world I live in right now.
I just go back to my chart in the lane. So this is scheduling, and I know you know, and I'm not pushing for it to do everything all at once. But in thinking through it, to do it now, you got to know the right email address, and that person's got to be not on vacation. And so all of those challenges. I mean, even if we just used one email address that 4 people had access to in the courthouse would be a step up from what we have. So we're building from me having a notebook with individual emails in all the counties. So I think this will be tremendous progress, and I think that eventually if we could get to a unified system where we build this out so if we have one scheduler that does all of these things would be terrific. And if we could attach documents to it or you do that through the Tyler system, where people could sign electronically, that would be wonderful, but that's not day one. Does anyone have any other questions? All right. One question, when do you anticipate that the first version or the pilot version will be available?
It's a few more weeks, I know. Jeff, do you know when you're looking to start the actual user testing? Is that towards the end of the month?
Yeah, so it's going to be ready in 2 to 3 weeks time, but we're going to have some internal Q&A testing for quality assurance of the product before we release it to the pilot group. So I think that pilot group is going to be a September thing. And then we're going to probably regroup after the pilot group and see if there's any modifications, changes, improvements that can be made before it's released to the greater court system, or maybe it's perfect.
So the short answer is, I think you're gonna have usability of it in 2 to 3 weeks. But once we get the application the way we want it and so forth, before we roll it out statewide, we will have to partner with Mr. Silver's team, get some training documentation, get training in place statewide, get some documentation on how to use the application, and communicate out across the state on what the process and procedure is for video usage and so forth.
Yeah, and
we'll have to involve OGC.
I like that video for the Crave system. I'd love to create one of those for this app.
Well, I'm glad that you all are able to discuss this with folks from both the prisons and the lab and the detention centers to let everybody know sort of where we're starting and where we hope to head in the long term. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. It's the time.
All right. Our next presentation is going to be from Matt Osborne and Troy Page. They're going to talk to us about some of the legal requirements regarding waivers, when perhaps we need to get a waiver, and what would be a way of doing this with someone that's represented and someone that is not represented. So thank you all very much. And
Thank you,
look forward to
Judge.
your presentation.
I'm Matt Osborne from the AOC's Office of General Counsel. Also here from General Counsel is Troy Page. And I talked with Judge McGee briefly before the meeting. We thought the best approach may be for me to give just a couple of minutes of background, and then we could go through the documents themselves and we can discuss those, try to field any questions that you have. My understanding is that at the April 1 meeting of the task force, Wesley Fick from our office, briefly toward the end of the meeting, raised an issue with the language in the statute 7A49.6 that says that in a criminal proceeding, if the right to presence or the right to confrontation is implicated, then the remote proceeding cannot go forward unless the court has obtained a waiver of the defendant's right to presence and right to confrontation. And I think Wesley mentioned also that back when we were conducting remote proceedings under the authority of the emergency directives from former Chief Justice Beasley and then later Chief Justice Newby, that our office had worked with Professor Denning at the School of Government to develop a template colloquy and a template waiver form for use in remote proceedings conducted under the emergency directives. And I believe Wesley's question was whether there was an interest in reviewing those documents, perhaps updating them, looking forward to make sure they comported with 7A49.6. And my understanding is, based on, again, a brief discussion toward the end of the April 1 meeting, and then I think some conversations that Wesley had with Judge McGee and Judge Bedour and others after the meeting, that there was an interest in moving forward with that. So toward that end, on, I think, May the 10th, Judge McGee, Judge Bedour met with several of us at the AOC to talk about a number of issues involving the colloquy and the waiver form. And as a result of that meeting, Troy and I developed 3 documents. One is a template colloquy for remote proceedings, or remote criminal proceedings, that is designed to update the old colloquy with an eye toward the new statute. The second was an updated template waiver form. Again, the same idea was to try to update the waiver form we had developed with the School of Government for use under the statute. And then a third document that came from that meeting was something that we had discussed with Judge Bedour and Judge McGee, which is a revision to the CR 300 transcript of plea form. And the idea there was to try to find a way, if the defendant was represented, that we could have an abbreviated version of the waiver language on the CR 300. And so the Shield, I think, put those in your email packet. Also, I think they're in your folder. And just a brief word about each before we look at them in detail. With regard to the waiver, the template colloquy and waiver form, again, these are based on versions that Troy and I developed with Professor Shay Denning at the School of Government. The colloquy has some length to it. Part of the concern was that we have that line of cases from the Court of Appeals about waivers of counsel and how there needs to be a fairly rigorous colloquy there. Part of the idea, too, was that it may not be necessary in every case to use all of the colloquy, so we wanted to be as thorough as possible so the information would be there. One thing you'll notice, though, if you were to compare the original colloquy and waiver form that we developed with the School of Government with the drafts you have before you, is that if you were to look back at those originals, or if you've used them, they tend to blend the right to presence and the right to confrontation. And so one thing that we've done with these new versions is to try to separate out the right to presence and the right to confrontation, because they won't always both be implicated. We shared our drafts with Professor Denning. She didn't have any concerns with them. And we also took a look at the drafts that I think Billy and Eric's subcommittee are developing in parallel in the juvenile context, made a few adjustments. So you guys may see some things that we borrowed from you, and so we appreciate that. With regard to the proposed revision of the transcript of plea, again, the idea there that Judge McGee and Judge Bedour had was If the defendant is represented by counsel, then there may be an abbreviated version of this colloquy in which the court could engage. So if the idea is if the defendant's represented, you could do something a little more abbreviated and move ahead with the plea hearing. If the defendant is unrepresented, then it may be necessary to engage in a longer, more rigorous colloquy and have the defendant use the template waiver form. There are a couple of things that you'll notice that we've highlighted on the CR 300 transcript of plea form, and those are highlighted in blue. The first is when the form references open court, and Troy and I just wanted to flag that for the committee's consideration, because as we move into more of these remote proceedings, it becomes less clear perhaps what open court is. So if the judge and the DA and the clerk and the defense attorney are all in the courtroom, but the defendant is not, are we comfortable saying that's still open court because the judge is on the bench, the clerk is there? If more of those folks are remote, if the DA also happens to be remote or the defense attorney also happens to be remote, again, the more of those folks that are not in the courtroom, again, what is the comfort level with saying that we're in open court? The other thing that we flagged, which is on, I believe it's page 2, side 1 of the form, is the defendant's acknowledgement. Right now, that is a clerk-driven acknowledgement. So the clerk is swearing the defendant to the form. The concern is that the clerk may not be co-located with the defendant. If the defendant's in the courtroom, then the clerk will be there. If the defendant is not in the courtroom, then you may have an issue with the clerk being able to swear the defendant to the form. And so another question we had was whether we would want to look at perhaps changing this from a clerk jurat to a more general notarial certificate where we would have perhaps both clerk or other notary. So that's perhaps too much background, but it's a way of saying that we've got the template colloquy, the template waiver form. Again, those were based on drafts that we developed with the School of Government during the pandemic period. And then a new item for consideration is the CR 300 transcript of plea form. And so, Judge, it's your and Mr. Caldwell's pleasure about how we'd like to move through these documents.
Well, if I could just ask a couple of questions that we've talked about this before. So trying to figure out, you know, when is a waiver necessary? And I understand that we don't have a case law on this, or enough case laws perhaps we'd like to be absolutely certain how this goes. But in terms of whether or not you appoint counsel or not, the discussion of appointing counsel is not a situation where there's any confrontation issues. I was comfortable that you wouldn't need someone to sign a waiver to appoint counsel, to ask them what they would like to do about a lawyer. The other issue where this comes up would be bond hearings. Typically, if we discuss, there's not an offer of testimony, so not a confrontation issue with that. And I think where we came down to was that accepting pleas would be an instance where there's not generally testimony offered in most, perhaps every case that I've been involved in. There's a waiver of testimony, and they simply allow the DA to narrate what the factual basis for the plea is. But there'd be a right present. So, as I understand legal counsel's, the Office of Legal Counsel's position would be that for pleas, we would need some form of waiver, but not for the other two issues. Is that correct?
Yes.
Right. I think that's where we came out, right? Again, I don't know how helpful it is, but the case law, there's a case, State v. Buchanan, that says the right to presence applies when the hearing has a reasonably substantial relation to the defendant's opportunity to defend. So I think, again, you probably, again, like you said, you've got a right to presence at plea because you're talking about the entry of a verdict, the entry of a sentence and judgment. Again, with bond hearings, advisement on counsel, probably not.
In terms of the definition of open court, the way that I've thought about it is I say I'm in open court, and typically I would, in almost every occasion, I'm in a courtroom with the doors unlocked and explain that. What is the defendant in open court if he or she is present on a video screen, and we just don't have much case law on how to interpret that. Is that fair?
Right, I think the issue is the judge, so to speak, the anchor? In other words, if the judge is there, are we saying that's open court? I think that's the position I think that some folks, some of the judges have taken. That if the judge is there, that the judge is serving as the anchor around which everybody else is revolving, so that would be open court.
And so typically with regard to the signatures, I think at least the way that I've done it, and I've seen other folks do it, is it's signed in advance. I would say my daughter is a law student and is interning in the federal courts, and I understand the way that they do it, at least in Mecklenburg, in Charlotte, is that there's a pad in front of the defendant. The defendant's in open court. They go through and have they go through the plea transcript, the clerk types in the answers, and then the defendant signs electronically on a pad in front of him or her, and it's immediately put into the PDF, and the clerk certifies that that's the person's signature is at least what my daughter told me how that works. So we're not there yet. I think typically the way that this has worked is that the defendant signs it in advance and the papers are there at the court, and I ask, sir, is that your signature? And the defendant says yes, and then the clerk certifies it to it in open court. I guess another way to do it would be that it could be certified by, if there's a change, by another official, perhaps in the jail. But the way that we've done it seems to work efficiently and hopefully is ultimately correct. So I don't know if there's anyone here that has done it in another way. And so in terms of our discussion about, which forms to use for a plea, sort of the notion on the plea transcript, for example,
Yeah, so if it helps, Judge, on the CR 300, the new section is the section on page 1, right at the top. And so we have the existing section that's in sort of a boldface heading there, the boldface blocking around it, which is the current language for rejection. And then that next section that picks up there, right, saying note to court for defendant appearing by remote, that note and then those 4 Roman numerals, that's the new section that would address the remote proceeding. And then it would pick up down below with the Arabic numerals, that's the existing plea transcript. So the new section is that 2 inches or so between the rejection and Arabic numeral.
and so just say, for example, with regard to question number 8 about citizenship and the consequences. If they're represented by a lawyer, the lawyer assists them in explaining that, and this just simply confirms it. Similar to that, there's these 5 questions concerning appearing remotely. If they're represented by a lawyer, sort of an understanding that a lawyer's had a full discussion with them about that before we get to this stage. So if it is a represented person, one option would be, if the judge is comfortable simply using this plea transcript. If the person is not represented by counsel, perhaps it would be necessary or advisable to have them sign this full waiver, go through that in detail with them, and perhaps have an extended colloquy with them.
Right. That was the idea I think we had discussed in May, was if represented, the abbreviated version may work. If not represented, we may have to go the longer route.
Does anyone have any questions about that?
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. I see the colloquy follows the statute and appropriately says that the defendant can asked to speak privately with their attorney at any time during the proceeding. So does the functionality allow us to put them in a room, technologically speaking, so that the judge is then removed? If the offender is in our prison system, their attorney is in another location, the judge is in a third location, there's going to be functionality that would allow them to speak through that system and the judge to essentially be, everyone else to be excluded from that.
That reminds me, on my drive over here, I thought I should put that on a list of things that we need to figure out. So, I would say that, it does say that, and we need to figure out how to do that. And so, in Cabarrus, we have a telephone out at the council's table, and we have a telephone beside the inmate in our jail. And if there's a question, then they can pick up the phone. To some degree, that's confidential. It's in open court. I typically would say to a person, you can speak with your lawyer on this phone. If you need a more confidential setting than that, we can make arrangements for that. That occasionally happens. But with these sorts of things, the lawyer should have gone through this in great detail, and that should be infrequent. But when it happens, it is a challenge for us. Typically, for us, it's been, are they going to dismiss those charges in district court or something along those lines that can be handled quickly? But sometimes you have to set it aside to give them an opportunity. I say sometimes in 2 years, maybe once or twice that's happened. But it is an issue that we will have to figure out how to address it.
Right, because just on the prison side, we're working to in many of our facilities to try to institute a dedicated telephone line for offender attorney phone calls, which we can talk about that part of it a little bit later. But those dedicated phone lines, even when they are in our facilities, are not likely to be in the same location where the video equipment for having these hearings are. The intention is to put those telephones kind of up by visitation and consider the attorney-client phone call to be almost kind of a species of attorney-client visitation. They're not back there where there's a phone on the desk for them to just call. So I would just potentially flag that as an issue. And it might be something that requires finessing the language or potentially the statute, because it says you can speak privately with your attorney at any time during the proceeding. At this point, with what we are forecasting, that's going to be very difficult on the prison side.
It would be, and I think, if it is something that the inmate needs to speak confidentially with the person and we don't have the ability to do it, to comply with this, we'd have to say, well, we can't do this right now. We'll give you an opportunity to speak with your client, and we'll set this back on for another time as quickly as we can.
Right.
But that is something that I think that is an issue that I should have flagged that we're going to have to develop. Probably not going to be perfect when we get started. We may have to set aside some cases to allow that communication to take place, but at least in my experience, that's been pretty rare that happens, but it does happen.
I know in Microsoft Teams, there's the ability to put people in a separate room, a virtual room.
Right.
So, Anthony, I don't know WebEx well enough, and so I'm sure it has that same technology. It just is going to require the clerk to be a little bit more of a traffic cop. And then obviously you and I and Ted can work on that in our courthouse to be able to transfer that to a workstation that's maybe not in the courtroom, so court can continue to proceed. So maybe we can work on that together to sand off the rough edges on that and then bring that back.
I can tell you, Judge Corpening has been doing that. It's called breakout rooms in WebEx. He's been doing that the last 2 years. Now, that's when the attorney is not in the courtroom.
Correct.
Send them, they raise their hand, virtual raise hand, come back in session. It's a off-camera, secure, encrypted discussion between those two. In the courtroom, we had that discussion earlier this morning. There can be some technology options to give that attorney, if he's in the courtroom, something to go out of the courtroom or what have you.
I think that can work to a certain degree. I think, the challenge is the inmate is here and the inmate's not alone on that side. And so, and the lawyer is in the courtroom, maybe the lawyer can go out of the courtroom, but so it's sort of like the phone, not a perfect solution. It's, you can hear one side of it, but that would be the challenge with that, is you'd have to leave the inmate alone to do that perfectly, I think.
And on the prison side, that might, in rare cases, present an issue. We'll have a training component for our officers to have to understand that in the courtroom proceedings, they're permitted to remain with the offender unless there's a requirement for an attorney-client communication, in which case they would need to understand that at that point they would need to step out or remove themselves. And there's going to be some small subset of offenders where that's not going to be acceptable. They will not be amenable to leaving the room with the offender in it. So again, that's something I think we just are going to have to work out sort of on a case-by-case basis.
Yes, ma'am.
Judge, just your use of the phrase setting aside, those can be loaded determinations, and whether that's an equivalent in this plea colloquy of rejecting the plea. Way I've seen it, and it's much like what you've described, when we're in court and the only ingredient that's missing is a remote defendant, inmate is literally just holding it open and maybe moving on to other work that can be done. And it's a hybrid. Yes, inmate is still there with jail officials, and I step down and prosecutor steps out, whether we have to clear the courtroom or whether it's the last plea of the day, all those things are factored into on the fly, making it move. I've never actually had to, I do reject pleas. I've never had to reject a plea on this issue, sign off on postponing it and further pretrial detention about that, so.
Thank you.
Your Honor, I just had a quick question. We talked a lot about pleas and things along those lines, and I always hated to bring it back to the crime lab, but that's kind of my thing. Was it y'all's also intention to believe that this waiver right would need to be done for testimony in district court, for the remote testimony by the analysts?
Right, I think the concern would be if you have a right to confront the analyst, then you would need to obtain a waiver of that right.
Okay. And I would ask about that question would be, since just like you have a right to a jury trial, you have that, you can appeal to Superior Court and have that right.
Right, so you do have those notice and demand provisions in Superior Court and then the District Court with the recent changes about if you've provided notice, then it can come in with the changes that the
Right.
Conference of DAs obtained to the statutes.
Right, that's I was kind of trying to think about, right, because the new statute talks about there being 3 ways to get the remote testimony of the analyst, which was basically notifying 15 business days, giving them the full file, but none of those has that there's a waiver, right? There's none of them that says, and the defendant must waive. The old statute used to have a waiver, and we found that they never signed it, therefore it never happened. My question is this going to turn into, again, where there's a waiver now and the course of action by defense attorneys, which might be the right course of action for them at that same, is never signing that, and therefore we kind of eviscerated what the law had tried to change.
Yeah, Troy may need to correct me or supplement, but I think the idea was to take the old notice and demand model that applied in both trial divisions, say that the district court, because you had the right to appeal, you didn't need to demand an opportunity to object. In district court, and you could go ahead and enter it without the defendant having the opportunity to object as long as notice was provided.
I just wanted to make sure.
Whether there's a defense attorney in the room who would argue.
Right, and I think that's something that'll be fleshed out at some point, and I just wanted to make sure because that we weren't creating another notice that maybe not was envisioned by the change in the statute.
Yeah, I think the idea was if legally confrontation is required, then you would need the waiver. And so then I think the question is whether as a result of the statutory changes, confrontation and waiver would no longer be required. Do you want
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, again, as Matt said, the drafts that you have in front of you were adapted from sort of the initial versions we adapted under the rubric of the emergency directives during the pandemic. But what has essentially superseded the emergency directives now is the audiovisual appearances statute that got enacted last year, so 7A 49.6, which provides that if the rights of confrontation or presence attach, you've got to get a waiver to proceed. But 49.6 itself specifically says it's not meant to abrogate the court's authority to conduct essentially remote proceedings under other statutes that already authorize it. And specifically names, for example, 15A 1225.3, which is the forensic analyst remote testimony. That's the notice and demand statute as Matt was describing. And so if, for example, you've got, basically the state has gone through the steps, provided the advance notice, the lab report's been provided in advance, and the defendant fails to object, and you then get to trial at that point, well, then you're not under a 7A 49.6 need a waiver of confrontation scenario because that statute already has accepted out the forensic analyst statute. And if that statute's been complied with, at that point, I don't think you actually need a waiver.
Okay.
If, for example, the defendant were to object to the remote testimony in response to the 1225.3 notice, then yes, I think the court still wanted to go forward with the remote testimony. Then you've got the confrontation waiver issue.
So the way you read out was state does everything it's supposed to, gives a discovery file, does everything. Defendant says, I don't care, I object, I want to confront this witness. At that point, if he or she doesn't sign the waiver, then it has to be in person.
And that would be my read of the two statutes in concert, yes.
Okay. And that's what you guys are advising and giving out to the courts as the read.
Yeah. And Matt Scott, from the budget bill last year, the amended, do you want to cover that one?
Yeah, so I think probably what you're asking is the changes in district court and the way that I would read the revised 1225.3 and the 2139.1 is it seems to be saying that if you've provided the information, there is no opportunity to object.
Correct.
Right. So again, I think the idea would be if you're in a scenario where notice and demand applies, which I think would be Superior Court now, and the defendant objects, you need the waiver.
Correct.
If you're in one of these situations covered by the bill where notice and where there's no longer a demand component, you just give the notice and then you're good to go in district court, then I don't think you would have the confrontation. Again, whether a defense attorney may argue some infirmity with the district court statute, but at least as written, I think what you're saying is my understanding, which is you no longer have the defendant's opportunity to object in district court.
And that's just what I want to clarify. And I appreciate that, taking the time to help walk me through it, because I think we were talking Superior Court, District Court, and I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page with
Yeah, so again, I know I'm repeating myself, but I think the idea would be the colloquy is there whenever legally there's a determination that confrontation applies and the defendant has a right to demand that confrontation. I think the idea behind what Senate Bill 105 did last year was to, at least at the district court level, remove that opportunity for the defendant to demand that.
Okay, I think we're talking the same language. So, thank you. Thank you, Your Honor. Sorry to take the time.
Oh, no, thank you. So is there any other questions about the forms, when to use the forms, what they're recommending? So let me ask next steps, the process for these being more than just drafts.
Well, that was one of the things that I think we had talked about when you talked to Troy and me was, I think it was, it's hard to remember now, Judge, whether it was earlier this week or the latter part of last week. But, right, I think one option would be for this group to give its imprimatur to these drafts. But then, given its imprimatur to the drafts, then I think the next decision would be Would you want these to remain as templates of some sort and say be available on a resource page someplace on Juno? Or would you, at least with regard to the form and the 300, would that be something that the task force should be formally asking the AFC to, at least in the context of the waiver, create a form, and in the context of the plea, revise a form? So I think the next step decision would be if the task force is comfortable with the content, how would they like that content to be memorialized going forward? Would you like it to remain sort of like it has been, the template colloquy and template waiver form, and have that available on Juno or some other resource page? Or is there an interest in asking the AFC to formally adopt the waiver form and then formally adopt the CR 300 for distribution statewide as formally adopted AFC forms?
And what would be the pleasure of the task force?
Well, Judge, he prompted us with this highlight about in open court, and we didn't have a whole lot of discussion about that. I think that what was said about the judge being the anchor makes a lot of sense. If I understand the acknowledgement, the revisions are highlight to draw our attention. There's no recommendation here that it be listed as an alternative for there to be a remote authenticator. Who that title might be.
I think the idea there, Judge, was whether to replace this clerk-specific sworn to affirm section with a more general notarial jurat, where if there's a notary on site, wherever the defendant's being detained, that notary could execute the form. Could acknowledge the defendant's signature, swear the defendant to the form, as opposed to what it's.
So again, in addition, and I always love it when you can simplify as opposed to expand upon, you just get rid of all these checks, it would just be a notary jury.
Right.
Yeah.
So that sort of highlighted blue section there, sworn to and all that, Paul may have to do some of his magic with fitting things in, but that would be the idea, would be to try to replace it with a more generalized, our standard notarial jurat.
Is there a statute that controls how this has to be?
It's just anyone who could swear the defendant to the form. And so I think the idea was just, and Todd may well speak to this, the idea is just traditionally the defendant would be there in court and the clerk would be there and swear the defendant to it. I think the concern now is that's not always going to be the case.
And we have a lot of estate forms the clerk, have all those listed with a notary as well. I mean,
So I think that kind of implicates not only what do we mean by in open court, but what do we mean by before me? Because there's generally not going to be a notary available on the offender's end in prison if it's a notary that can, be done, notarial service that can be done remotely, meaning that the notary is in the courthouse and can, if there's a way to do that, but there's not generally going to be on-demand notarial services that are available at least not in the prisons.
So sworn, affirmed, and subscribed before me. In open court, what I consider to be open court, I ask the person, did you sign this? And they say yes. Maybe they signed it yesterday, but they're affirming that they signed it.
Well,
I've taken that to be that's what that means.
If I may, Judge, part of the reason that we highlighted that section to ask if the task force would prefer to see a more general notarial certificate, as Mr. Tilley says, a lot of our AOC forms have the equivalent of a notarial jurat, and yes, there is actually a template for it, a limited template for it in Chapter 10B for each of the notarial certificates. But a lot of our forms essentially have a jurat, and then they have check blocks for clerk, deputy clerk, assistant clerk, magistrate judge, or notary. And so we essentially cut sort of a check block for everybody, all of the regular folks who administer those in our context. But part of the reason we raised that issue is to allow for the possibility I understand in some facilities it won't be the case, but that it might have to actually be authenticated in the location where the defendant is. Our general advice to clerks, and that's the context in which this comes up the most, is the clerk's authority to administer oaths in their official capacity as a clerk, ex officio, is governed in the same way that a notary's administration of oaths is governed by Chapter 10B. And therefore, it has the same sort of procedural requirements as well as the same limitations. And a notarial certificate before me means literally that under Chapter 10B, and the definitions are fairly tight. It means physical presence, close physical proximity, and the ability to physically hand documents back and forth between one another. And so one of the challenges that we have faced whenever getting questions about remote proceedings is, what can be signed by remote is one question. What can be notarized by remote is a separate question and is much more tightly constrained, at least under the statutory framework we have now. And so that's what prompted the question is, would you want this jurat changed so that it is not clerk specific, on the assumption that there will be scenarios in which when the defendant is remote, we've got to actually have somebody in the same location as the defendant who can administer oaths. You can't do a notarial certificate by remote. Now, the legislature has enacted some expanded authority for true notaries in the last couple of years to perform certain notarial acts electronically and remotely. The very short version, summarizing and condensing a great deal, is that would not cover the clerks. So I think the question solely for this form is we can't sort of solve the remote signature and remote notarization issue within the context of the form. The only question here is, do we want to expand this jurat to cover the other officials who can administer oaths when we might have somebody other than a clerk in the defendant's location?
And Judge, just to further that, I think as far as the concern about the presence of a staff to cover and seize upon this efficiency as opposed to defeat efficiency and requiring the transport for their presence with a clerk, if we're going to do that, we may as well transport them, right? Is that notaries can execute a jurat with signatures that are not done in their presence after the fact, upon proving the presence, that they do have a physically present, identification is verified, and they say this is my signature, and yes, I signed it before I signed it in front of you. That meets the requirement for a notary. They don't have to be there.
Yes.
They don't have to be. That's what's unique about notary versus clerk, is what he's saying. Follow me?
Yes, I do. And that's generally how notary services are handled in the facilities currently. I'm just pointing out that it does say before me, so I think this discussion of what do we mean by before me is valid, because in the prison side, that is not generally done before the notary, because the notary is not going, generally almost never would be at the proceeding that the offender is participating in. We are not saying we can't get it notarized after the fact. We just can't have a notary that's available to do it at that time.
Right.
And we really need it done before and sent to the court. We need it sent to the court before the hearing is taking place, unless we can get electronic signatures somewhere down the line. And that's how I think we've all been doing it, those of us that have been doing it remotely. So would the suggestion be then to add notary as an additional block, and perhaps make it available immediately on the website, and seek formal AOC approval and use it in the interim?
That'd be my motion.
I'd second that motion.
Pardon?
I'd second his motion.
Any discussion about that? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? All right. Like the ayes have it. any other questions about what has been covered here today by thank you all very much.
Judge, just to clarify, the motion and vote was on the 300 to swap out the jurat with our more general, broader jurat. The idea would be to post the revised version on some sort of resource area on the webpage and then submit it to the director for formal approval.
Yes.
I didn't do, so that was for the 300. Was that vote also inclusive of the waiver colloquy and form?
I understood it to be.
Okay.
Is that correct? All right.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
sir. Approve the documents that you all prepared. Yes, sir. And perhaps they could be placed on the remote proceedings website, or portion of the website.
Public facing.
Yes. All right, it is about 11:45. We have the updates from the different subcommittees. Why don't we take about a 15-minute break, come back at 12 o'clock and hear those reports. Thank you. All right, I believe we're ready to resume the meeting. Thank you all. Just an announcement, when the general meeting is over, the prison subcommittee will be meeting in here. I understand the jail subcommittee is not going to meet this afternoon. I understand that there has been food prepared for everyone, so whether or not you're staying for a meeting or not, I hope that you will join us in having lunch. At this point, we have got about 55 minutes or so. So we have 4 reports, and I would ask if folks could leave 10 to 15 minutes each for each report to give us an update on where we are in each committee. And the first subcommittee that we are going to hear from will be the juvenile subcommittee with Mr. Zagri and Mr. Lasser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate it. And I'll be short. I won't take the whole 10, 15 minutes. But we have been meeting as a subcommittee. This was a subcommittee that was set up as a subcommittee of the jail committee because we really felt juvenile was different than what we're seeing in jails, and we really needed to take on some of the procedures and things that needed to be handled for just juvenile. We've met 3 times since the subcommittee's been formed. We've got folks from the defender's office, the prosecutor's office. We've got our facility staff. We've got our court counseling staff that are involved in these discussions and made a lot of progress. We've also had the school of government that's been involved in helping us with some of the forms and development of the forms. And so they're not quite ready yet, but we'll have the forms maybe by the next meeting to present to folks on the waivers and that will be presented in juvenile court. A lot of juvenile courts during the pandemic went under the emergency guidelines, and we went to a lot of virtual courts. In fact, about 70% of them were virtual. And I would say we've switched almost completely back now to almost all in person again as the pandemic has started to go down. And that's really the challenge for juvenile justice as a whole is to really figure out how do we staff up to make this work. If we're going to transport kids, we need transportation drivers. But even if we're doing virtual hearings, we need staff that will be there with them while they're doing the virtual hearings in the detention facilities. And so we can reallocate staff to do that. That used to be transportation drivers. It saves us a lot of gas and a lot of energy to do that. But what we find is that because our detention centers often serve a 10 to 15 county area instead of just one county, that if the court does not get the 9 o'clock hearing that they want, then they say, well, then just bring them over here, transport them. If we can't have the 9 o'clock hearing, we want you to transport them. And so we really need to figure out that scheduling app. I think is a really big part of what we're struggling with is to try to figure out how do we make that work and make sure that we have a morning and afternoon session that's considered by the court as we're doing the virtual hearings, so that there's a possibility that we can spread them out. And then helping our staff figure out how to manage that. We've actually assigned a staff member in each of our facilities that's in charge of doing all the virtual hearings because they are coming in from all of those different counties across their catchment area, and sometimes farther than that if the kid needs to be transported to a different facility. So we are trying to really work with New Hanover because they've got the most sophisticated equipment and have been doing it the longest, and Judge Corpening and he's on our subcommittee, and he's really helping us develop the guidelines and recommendations as we move forward. We've got a couple of legislative requirements that we'd like to look at changing that we can bring to the full task force at the next meeting. But one of those is really to look at the parent waiver also. Parents are required to be part of juvenile hearings, and right now it's not clear in the statute whether they can waive that or not. And so we really want to look at the statutory language on that and make it a requirement that they do waive if we do go to a virtual hearing, because they can be held in contempt of the court, or they can also be sanctions can be given to the parents in juvenile hearings. So we do think that they should have a right to either waive or not waive that right in court. And so that's just one example. We're also talking about what types of hearings are the best types for juveniles to have. And we're working on a best practice list that will be listed for judges about which types of hearings we think work best for it. But we don't want to limit it in statute because Judge Corpening gave the example of we had talked about maybe just doing secure custody hearings and those types of hearings as what we would be looking at for virtual court. and not doing adjudications and dispositions because they're so involved, and allow those to still be in person. But we have situations where kids come to New Hanover County, for example, while they're on vacation, and have a violation, and instead of making them drive all the way back from Shelby, do a virtual hearing. A lot of times the defendant is asking for the possibility of doing a virtual hearing so they don't have to drive the kid 3 hours just to have that hearing. So we don't want to limit the types of procedures that could be handled in that way in case it makes more sense to do it in those methods, but create a best practice list for the courts about which types of hearings work best. Overall, like we discussed earlier, we talked about because kids do have to go every 10 days. One of the things that has come up as one of the issues is for those secure custody hearings, of really allowing the victims also to have access to virtual court or videotape testimony. We've heard, for example, down in Charlotte, the victim is having to come every 10 days to testify to keep that kid in secure custody, and that's just not fair to victims. And so really coming up with a way that would make that more accessible for the victims also in those hearings. We're looking at our court counselors and where they can best be stationed during these hearings. And so having a court counselor that be available at the detention site, but also having one in the courtroom, because often they're the ones that are kind of shepherding the process through, but also making sure that the kids can know what they're about to sign and understand all the rules that go along with it. Like I said earlier, we do have a unit in every detention facility, so we're ready to go from the juvenile side. It's just really getting the courtrooms ready to go and making sure they're up to speed. So that's why we're working with the ones that do already have the CRAVE systems in the courtrooms, so that we could see how that works and get those best practices out to the other courtrooms across the state. So those are just some of the best practices and some of the legislative. We've also worked on the forms based off of what we just heard, we might need to make a couple of changes based off of the forms that we just saw presented. So we're going to go back and just make sure we've got all those right before we present them to the full task force. Eric, you?
Well, also, we're talking about, juvenile being adjudicated in one county and disposition in another county. That's very frequent. If you're not familiar with juvenile court, your legal custody can be somewhere other than where you're living because your placement might be there. And so having the option of plea, if you've met with your attorney and you're not contesting that might be easier on the juvenile and more efficient. So as we were looking at the plea transcript, there is this, if you're not familiar, there is a separate juvenile transcript of plea. So we should be placing that same language in the juvenile transcript of plea, and we can work with legal counsel on that. One of the things that we're also mindful of is developmental language, because kids and youth, hear things differently, and sometimes it's harder for them to understand. And so we've sort of gone back and forth on that, and we've tried to work with that on the waiver. I was just kind of eyeballing the colloquy as Matt and Troy were presenting. It looks pretty good to me. We may have a couple of suggestions. One of the terms that has been one of contention is the term waiver, because that's kind of hard to explain, to an adolescent. And so we like to use the words give up. That makes more sense to them. But we also know that it is this particular legal term of art that needs to be there. So we're trying to figure out sort of the best way of doing that. But like was expressed, I mean, we definitely need some flexibility in juvenile court because so many courts operate so differently, and because there's not a detention center, of course, in every county, we need to do that. But I think it's worked well, and we should have those we're very, very close. We'll have those recommendations done.
Thank you. Anyone have any questions for Mr. Lester?
Judge,
Yes, sir.
I do for Billy. I'm glad that you have Judge Corcoran, you mentioned him there as part of this subcommittee. I'm not a Crave County yet. Clerk Tilly is. I didn't hear you reference a clerk on your subcommittee. The reason I bring that up, Billy, is you're talking about how this scheduler could really be advantageous to juvenile, and I agree it will. Just in the back and forth you had with the vendor here, my experience as a non-Crave County has been, it's all been on the court counselor shoulders to facilitate any remote proceeding. Some are better at that than others. In fact, instead of it being a caseload thing, it ends up being one court counselor is more comfortable with it, and so they do all hearings in my judicial district. My point is, if there can be uniformity, I think it should be achieved. It's not the instance in these other settings, whether we're talking about inmates, whether they're jail or prison, or in other instances, the anchor is the clerk. I mean, we say the judge is the anchor, but the anchor is the clerk. So as far as scheduling these hearings and giving notice, in fact, when it comes to things that aren't statutorily permitted already for them to be convened remote, there is a certain amount of pushback among some of my colleagues, not speaking for the other 99 counties, that I didn't give you permission to have this remote, as the judicial official. And last thing I think juvenile justice needs is to be put at odds with a presiding judge. Presiding judges tend to have more of a spirit of we're in this together with the clerk, I think, and if the clerk schedules it that way, then they just go with it and they just do it. So it's just sort of an idea I had when I heard you talking about that.
Excellent point. We'll definitely add some clerks to the discussion, and if anybody wants to volunteer, we'll take volunteers, but we'll reach out to the association also and see if there's somebody that they want to appoint to it. That's a great point.
And Judge, we have had Lindsay Spain from AOC Legal, who I know works closely with the clerks in those meetings.
Thank you. If I could just mention one thing about, Judge Heath had talked about defaults and sort of working through and trying to figure out what sort of hearings really would make the most sense doing remotely. And if you can develop a consensus that's the default for this with the presiding judge in a county. For example, we do all of our civil hearings in Superior Court remotely. So we could have made the default that it's going to be in person unless you ask to do it remotely. We did it the other way. It's going to be remote unless you petition to make it in person. I think I maybe have had one person that wanted to have an in-person hearing, one or two. These are non-evidentiary hearings, summary judgment motions, those sorts of things. So trying to think through what hearings can be done remotely, what makes the most sense, and working to build a consensus and make that the default, I think it would be a helpful thing.
Absolutely, and so we've listed for juvenile what we think those are as far as the best practice, but as I said, we didn't want to eliminate it also because there may be a particular case where it makes more sense to have a couple of those other hearings be possible, so we don't want it to be statutory, but we want to send out best practice of what we think would be the best way to use virtual court.
As a district attorney, I think I'm fully supportive of doing as much virtually as we can. One of the hurdles that we're going to have on secure custody hearings and some of the other hearings is the same hiccup that we run into with the issue of doing pleas with DAC inmates. And that's the ability for the defense attorney to have a confidential communication with the juvenile. So that'll be something that'll have to be a process that'll have to be figured out.
We did talk about that at our last meeting, and so we're trying to figure out if it's going to be the phone communication like was described earlier, or if it's going to be a breakout room. And I know in New Hanover they are using the breakout room in WebEx, but it has had problems with getting, when you go to the breakout, how do you get people back from the breakout? How do you know the breakout's over? And because a lot of times the defense attorney is not actually in the courtroom either. And so once that confidential, because when we're doing our hearings right now, because juvenile courts are closed, we're not even having a staff member in the room, unlike adult correction. We have them standing right outside the room, and it's in a glassed-in, windowed room, so we can see what's going on if they're tearing up the equipment or anything like that. But so if they need to move to those virtual rooms to do the confidential talks with attorneys, can the kid do that himself, or is it something that the clerk can drive so the kid doesn't actually have to touch any of the buttons or anything on the machine, which is what we're trying to figure out how to do best, because we don't really want them messing with the equipment at all.
Just call a 10-minute recess. If they're not done, then when they come back live, you put them back in for anything.
I mean, my experience has been, specifically to the secure custody hearings, is it's really a 10, 15-minute pre-hearing conference between the attorney and the juvenile. Once that's finished, there does need to be some ability if necessary, but I've rarely seen it needed to have a private communication once that pre-trial, or that pre-hearing conference has been completed with the attorney and the juvenile.
One of the things that our office does is, one of our practice points is, you get to the juvenile. I mean, obviously, if the juvenile is picked up, it has to be brought in within 24 hours. You're unlikely to have any conversation. But we always train the attorneys to have those conversations beforehand and talk about, even if it's just secure custody, so it would hopefully eliminate, some of the need for that. But there's always an exception. But we're very focused on that, making sure that communication is going beforehand. Because I did this almost 25 years ago, but when I practiced in Greensboro, we had one of the first video conferencing systems long before there was a pandemic. And so, you had sort of, the bat phone next to you and you were talking, and that was not, I would only have, very, quick conversations about, the judge just said this and I'm just explaining further, kind of what the court was talking about. But to have it confidential, the preference would be, eliminating, anybody else who can listen.
All right. Thank you all very much. I am next up with the prison subcommittee report. And our pilot is between Cabarrus and Piedmont Correctional. We've conducted approximately 4 remote hearings, but have not done it in a systematic way. We're hopefully making progress towards that. I, along with one of our assistant DAs and an assistant in the DA's office, went and met recently with the warden, assistant warden, and several other staff members to work on the details of the pilot. I'm rotating back into Cabarrus County for the next 12 months. So I am hopeful that we can make some progress in moving the project forward. I'd like to just specifically go through the lanes of the project that I talked about earlier. With regard to equipment, we have one video conference set up at Piedmont, I understand. Scheduling, we are using the method that John Woodlock has created. Vicki Wall is the assistant in the DA's office, is the point person for scheduling. She had prepared a draft writ that we talked through with Piedmont. We have added to that draft writ the WebEx room in which these hearings take place. We've included that at the top of the writ and indicate that it is for a virtual hearing. We have developed when we started the pandemic, we were sending out individual links for hearings. We've, with the help of others, we figured out you can create a WebEx room so it's the same link every time for that courtroom. And so that is what we have been utilizing. I understand with regard to the communication lane that Piedmont will be the second pilot that the prison system is working on setting up to allow confidential communication between attorneys and their clients. I understand that they have one office space that they're going to convert for that purpose. The document exchange, as I mentioned earlier, is the biggest challenge with these hearings, utilizing fax and email. And as I think I said, the attorneys work that out generally with either someone in the warden's office or the individual that is presenting the inmate to them. What we hope to do is document the successful procedures that we developed throughout this process to cover really the 3 main lanes. That's the communication part, the scheduling part, and the document exchange. Document how we do that in writing, and then hopefully use that to spread hearings from Piedmont to other jurisdictions. And also, hopefully, it'll be a template that could be used by other facilities as we move forward. Our discussions early with the prison system is, we certainly wanted this to be a collaborative process and not overwhelm them with everyone on Monday saying, all right, we're ready for our remote hearing. So it's an ongoing process. I think we're making progress. I think we're working on the components that we'll put together and hopefully find a successful way to spread this to other places. And I wanted to give Ms. Harrison an opportunity to comment on any of the things that we've talked about, or anyone else that's present would like to discuss any issues that we have.
Thank you very much. I have just a little information about the attorney phone lines, which we are kind of running as a separate but obviously related project that's not necessarily linked up to the court proceedings, because we've just identified outside of that, certainly the desire on the part of the attorneys and a need to have those attorney phone lines available for attorney-client conversations. I do need to offer a correction, which you, sir, were not aware of because I wasn't aware of. According to Piedmont, the location has been designated for an attorney phone line, but the facility VoIP system is actually through a vendor. I'm telling you, I know nothing more than what I'm telling you. When I tell you that I know that that's voice over IP, that is the extent of my knowledge of technology. But that will require additional costs. We have to reach out to that vendor to do the necessary work for that. Excuse me. So actually, because they are moving that project forward kind of on an as they can do it. Foothills, which we haven't talked about in terms of the work of this committee, but they will have the attorney phone line in place, excuse me, by August 19th. Maury will have theirs up, should be up actually now. It looks like the next one that they are going to be able to easily work on is Anson, and hope to have that up by the end of the month. So on the prison side, we're really just doing this, excuse me, where they have an identified location and the manpower can easily get that process set up. But there is a hiccup on Piedmont in particular because it's through a vendor.
Okay.
Excuse me.
I want to mention, I see that Mr. Weed is joining us remotely. We had a discussion recently about the confidentiality and the concerns that we all have to make sure that it's used for the proper purpose. And so he's going to be part of that conversation along with others to try to develop a clear message about what it's appropriate to be used for and what it's not. I did also want to mention that in the packet, there is the written data that we have for the various facilities. So you can see the volume that each place has in terms of, we're going to meet after this meeting to have our subcommittee meeting, but I think this is helpful information to see, where we could get the most out of in setting up additional pilots. The women's prison obviously is one that has the greatest number, but I wanted to make sure everybody was aware that this information was in the packet. All right. Does anyone have any questions about the report? All right. Thank you very much. Next up is the jail subcommittee report, and turn that over to Mr. Caldwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This subcommittee has not met, and we are waiting to get more clear guidance from the folks in the courtroom venue of what the needs of the courts are, and then what proposals the IT folks have to then see how that would be implemented in the jails. We're not like the Division of Adult Correction, Division of Prisons, which is all one agency. There's 90-some jails across the state, all independently operated. So I don't anticipate there being any particular needs that would be problematic, but there are a lot of issues that we've discussed, that have been discussed today, that directly affect what happens in the courtroom, what happens between the judge, the clerk, the lawyer, the defendant. And so we're waiting to get some clear guidance from the task force on that and how the IT folks plan, what their needs are. And then the thought is to convene the subcommittee and also invite a group of jail administrators from across the state to offer their analysis of how that might be implemented on the local level. I do think it'd be helpful if Lieutenant Lister could give us some insight into what they're doing in Cabarrus County, particularly how they're addressing this issue of confidential communications between lawyers and their clients, and how the hearings have been going, how many they've had, and how it's working since they've already got that running.
We're still, at this point, since the last meeting, I think we've had probably 20, 25 remote hearings from inside our facility. Working with the DA's office, they've actually reached out to other counties, and they haven't given me that number yet. I would probably assume they're probably 20 to 25, also working with Iredell, Rowan, Stanley. Matter of fact, I've already got 2 virtual writs for next week for Iredell and Gaston. So that's coming along fairly well. But as far as increasing the numbers, we're kind of staying probably in about a 3-month period, probably about 20, give or take. We are still doing advisements for Rowan County especially. If we have one far off, whether 2 or 3 hours out, I'll reach out to Judge Wilhelm or Judge McGee, and if we can get an advisement done that way, we handle it that way. For secure communication, Judge McGee mentioned earlier, we do have a phone sitting at that table, and it's probably not going to be the best for each county. August 22nd, we're starting our new video visitation system, and this will allow the attorneys to tie in remotely from their office, from their car, from the courthouse, straight into the inmate inside the facility if they need to. They'll pick up the phone, they'll call our visitation desk, they'll make the connection, and at that point, the inmate will walk up to the visitation into the private room that we have set up, and they can do their attorney visit at that point. It'll take us about 8 days to get everything set up. So the 22nd through the 25th, give or take, we're anticipating 60% of the equipment being installed. And at that point, they can start, the attorneys and the public can start scheduling visits. But the following Tuesday is when we will go live. So an attorney effectively, if he's sitting in the courtroom and he knows that he's scheduled for a plea, and our court set them schedules. So if he's got a plea at 2 o'clock, if he wants to talk to that inmate in private, he'll just pick up his phone, call our place, and then he'll go back on his phone and click a button, because it's an app on your phone, and he'll start talking to the inmate face to face right there. So it'll work out fairly good once we get it started, but right now that's the premise of why we went with this company to get it done. So they can actually have that secure communication from wherever they're at. And we do have a location in each section of the jail for those inmates to go.
Lieutenant, is your video visitation then not generally recorded? Like if it was?
Not for attorneys, it won't be.
Okay, so they have the ability to turn that recording off?
Yes, whenever the attorney logs in and they create their account, they'll list themselves as an attorney. Of course, we'll vet to make sure that it's not, somebody on the street saying that. So we'll vet that, then we'll approve it. Then at that point, it's already earmarked that it's not going to be recorded.
Thank you.
Yep.
And I would say, we mentioned earlier, this is a big change from the way things have been. Somebody brings a cell phone, a lawyer brings a cell phone into a locked facility, a jail or a prison, and gives it to an inmate to make an unrecorded call. That's a serious criminal charge. And so this, and inmates, other conversations, other communications are subject to being monitored. And so this will be a big change. And so we need to make sure that folks understand the limited purpose this is used for, and make sure that there's consequences for violating that. And so I think it's fundamental to this process working is that folks are able to communicate remotely. There's going to be great benefits for that. It's going to, I think, make access to justice improved, because people are going to be able to see their clients easier, quicker, more efficiently. So I think this is going to have tremendous benefits. but this also strikes at the heart of what we're trying to do if it's used for an improper purpose. So we're gonna have to work to make sure that we have that part of it covered as well, given what a tremendous change this is going to be. Any questions for the jail subcommittee? All right. And then finally, I'd like to talk briefly and give a report about the state crime lab. This is a project between the crime lab and our district court and other district courts. The pilot initially is between Cabarrus and the Triad Lab. You will see in your packet there is a map that shows the 3 different labs for toxicology that are used: the Western Lab, the Triad Lab, and the Raleigh Lab. When we met last April, we had held our initial meeting and practice session with the Triad Lab. Since that meeting, we have had 4 DWI trials in district court involving remote testimony in Cabarrus County. They have all been conducted without any problems or issues. And so I would like to talk through the lanes that I've identified as at least helping me think through the project. One is equipment. We do not have a CRAVE system in district court in Cabarrus. Our one system is in Superior Court, but because of the work of our county IT department, we have a similar system that has functioned and worked fine. Scheduling, we are not trying to reinvent the wheel. We already have a system where folks know when they're supposed to be in court for a trial. And so the issue is notifying the lab analyst and the proper way to connect in. And so that has been handled by our assistant district attorneys. We have one in particular who's heading up the project that's been the most involved in that. So scheduling has not been an issue. I think the first time there was a question about what link should be used, but we're working on making clear that the connection that should be used and the time that it should be scheduled. Just like cases being scheduled in person in regular court, they try to work to have a specific time for the analyst being there, so the analyst is not there all day. The analyst comes in, provides a testimony, and then leaves. This would defeat the purpose of this if the analyst was on hold all day until the case was actually reached. So trying to figure out a similar way of scheduling things has been important. Communication. This is not private communication between lawyer and client. It's communication between the lab analyst and the defense attorneys. I understand that has worked well. The document that's provided to the lawyer includes the analyst report includes that analyst's telephone number. I understand the analyst is available during the business hours each business day for communication. I think there's not been any issue with that, so the attorneys have been able to talk with the analyst in advance to answer questions prior to case being called for trial. And the document exchange that has been handled by the assistant DA. Whenever there's a notice that has to go out 15 business days in advance. I understand when that's provided, the report is also provided. The Conference of DAs prepared a draft protocol. I've worked on one as well. We've not shared that yet, but we hope to work together at our next meeting of the subcommittee to try to come through with the protocols that we are going to follow in Cabarrus, and if they're successful, hopefully that can extend to other places. I understand that a hearing was scheduled in New Hanover, and as a result of the analyst being ready to go, the case ended in a plea, or at least that perhaps was one of the reasons it resulted in a plea. And Director Martinucci estimated that one case saved 5 hours of travel time. You can also see in the packet the number of district court subpoenas of lab analysts by county. For some reason, Cabarrus stands out as very active. I'm not sure exactly why that is, but apparently we lead the way in subpoenaing lab analysts, so perhaps it's good that we are the pilot to reduce some of that. We will schedule a subcommittee meeting in the near future to review the progress. We had talked about the possibility of developing a special subpoena for lab analysts, but I believe that the crime lab thought it might be just more helpful to have a simple cover sheet to send over with the subpoena that provides certain information, and they're in the process of developing that. I understand several counties have expressed an interest in expanding. Again, one of the building blocks is making sure they have a crane system or similar type of system to make this work. So hopefully more and more places will come online and have the equipment necessary to do this. I would ask if Director Martinucci or Mr. Llewellyn or anyone else from the Crime Lab would like to provide any additional information. We would welcome that.
I just wanted to state that as far as the courtroom having a Crave system, I think we've had a lot of success in just using laptops with different people that are part of the proceeding to make that much easier for the courtrooms that don't have the system. I don't know, Wayne, if you can speak to or how that's been going.
The use of the laptops and just our spaces in the laboratory has been working very well. We've actually now done or logged in for remote testimony in all three of our laboratory sites, be it Raleigh, the Western Lab, and Triad on those 4 occasions. So the New Hanover was out of the Raleigh. That was plea. The one out of Western actually resulted in a continuance. So we're looking total right about 20 hours of travel time savings so far. Just here in the past couple months, so that's been really good. But in terms of the infrastructure we have in place, it's been working very well for this project.
And I would say in terms of the equipment, so dividing it up between the courtroom and the lab, having the Crave system in the courtroom is helpful for folks to be able to see and hear everyone. Certainly a laptop of the lab analyst has worked absolutely fine, just as it would work from a jail or prison as a basis for communicating with the court. So I guess the necessary elements are a little different for the crime lab than they are for the other entities that we're working with. But I think the practice that has been developed over the years for how an analyst knows what time to be at what court is no reason at this point to reinvent that with a specialized scheduling system. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
So, scheduling priority, if there's a way for this type of appearance to not be treated the same, I think to your experience, that's not a surprise at all that suddenly the analyst is available to testify in his plea. I'm not going to comment on why that's a strategy, but it is in fact. And, and trying to deal with backlog reduction on DWIs in particular, this age-old, all too common every workday battle among judicial districts where the first reserve, right, Cabarrus, you're it. You're the one that do it. You're the ones that do it. You're good at that. You're good at getting notice to them. You're first on the list and have to wait until you release them. If there's some way to treat this remote testimony different, you put your thinking caps on. I'd really like to see that happen because it will make a difference in getting these cases disposed. It's not going to require any more travel time. It's not going to even require any testimony. It's just a matter that they're available.
Yeah, I think we talked about that the last subcommittee about how those are prioritized, because right now we do have a priority system, and whether we get that virtual versus in-person testimony prioritized is still under discussion.
And Your Honor, I think we also had that in that conversation, the conversation resolved around that we know that some counties just don't have the technology. And so we would end up, if we jump to priority for virtual, we may be saying the smaller counties who don't have technology, now you're at the bottom and everything like that, but you don't even have it. So
I'm sorry, I don't have a suggestion.
Yeah.
I just hope y'all will find an answer to that.
We are, and I think our overall goal is to, when we hit a tipping point, to say, all right, now priority goes to virtual, and then maybe that's a tipping point for those who have kind of dragged their feet, not because of lack of funds or lack of anything other than desire. We'll say, well, we need to start getting in on this, and maybe we can try and push the last couple of people over that finish line.
All right, thank you all very much. Well, and I certainly appreciate everyone being here, taking the time out of your schedules to appear here and work through this with us. I think we've made considerable progress. We have some ways to go yet. I think much of this work will be developed through our subcommittee meetings. And as I indicated, the prison subcommittee is going to meet here shortly today. And I wanted to give also folks an opportunity, if there's anything in particular that we have a few minutes that anyone would like to address, that if there's in terms of the things that I've listed as issues that I think we need to work on, if you have something for the group that you'd like to provide us now, or to contact any of us, the staff or me or Mr. Caldwell offline if you would like. But anything that anyone else would like to discuss at this point that we've not included on our agenda? All
I
right.
just have a procedural question real
Yes,
quick, Chair. But the recommendations on the forms today, we've got several recommendations, a couple that are statutory. Is there a plan for the task force as a whole to put out a final report or a report to the legislator to help us with getting those legislative items moved? Or is it something that you guys will take the recommendation and then I'll just take it to the legislator from there and say that the task force has endorsed it? Or do y'all have a plan on that?
I would say if there's any legislative recommendations coming out of this group, at least as far as Chief Justice Newby and the judicial branch are concerned, I probably want to take that to him, get his blessing, and then we can work together if your secretary blesses it as well, and we can have sort of a broad approach with the stamp of approval from the task force, and could set us up for success there. Does that work for you?
Absolutely, yeah. Yep.
All right. I believe lunch is available for us in the cafeteria. And so for those of you that are on the prison subcommittee, I think welcome to bring your lunch back here and we can start our meeting. Those of you that are not meeting with us, thank you all very much. You all have safe travels home. Thank you.